and welcome to the summer session of the 7th Annual Tony Woyak History Festival, sponsored by Washburn Heritage Association and the Washburn Area Historical Society. I'm Susan Macrith, and I'm one of the volunteers at the Washburn Museum. We want to extend our thanks also to and recognition to the Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy, which funds this summer event and has funded the ones previous. We're delighted that Rick Gilman and an anonymous drummer has provided the music for the evening, sponsored by his drummers never get the credit. We'll avoid the joke about musicians and one drummer. There will be a 10-minute intermission.
He's married to a bass player.
Where you feel free to move around and get a drink from the bar or refreshments from the back of the room. The refreshments, by the way, are made by Coco's. And also, there will be a quiz. No, actually, no. It's a survey. But if you could fill it out, we'd appreciate it. It's that little blue piece of paper on your tables. So just fill that out and let us know how we're doing. Also, we hope you can join us in 2 weeks on the 24th of July when Irene Blakely will take us back for a look at the Finn settlement. But tonight's presentation is about World War I, and Bob Macrith is here to tell us how our little town responded to this great war. So please welcome Bob Macrith.
I can always count on pronouncing my name right in the introduction. So thank you, Susan. And thank you, guys. What a wonderful musical introduction we had here. Let's see how we get this. Okay, we'll get this mic situated very quickly. Folks in the back hear me okay?
That's good.
All right, I tend to bellow. I see familiar faces in the back there? Yay, hey. Wow, thank you all for coming out, first of all. I always get such a kick out of coming out to these history festival for many reasons. The familiar faces in the audience, the good fellowship, the support that you see for preservation of local history, and as always, to honor the memory of our dear friend Tony Woyak, who did so much for historic preservation in this community. Tonight, I'm going to be talking, as we say, about the Great War. Comes to Washburn, comes to this little town on the shore of the greatest of all lakes. And as I move the podium up, I'm not going to mess with that mic anymore. I'm just going to move the podium. It weighs more, but it's less finicky. There we go. How's that look now? All right.
Speak right into it.
There we go. All right.
You need it up.
Up. Oh, I see what's going on here. All right. We're doing good. How's this? Work out for you folks? Excellent. All right. So, the First World War, the Great War, as it was referred to at the time, shaped the world that we live in today. It led directly into the Second World War and the Russian Revolution. It created the mess that we deal with on a regular basis in the Middle East. It led more or less directly to a number of trends and events, both good and bad. The voting rights for women, the end of colonialism on the one hand, prohibition on the other. Yeah, prohibition. Keep that in mind. It's just around the corner. Stock up. Far from the battlefields of Europe, though, the Great War had a profound impact on our little town on the edge of Lake Superior. Most of us are well aware of the brief but intense economic eruption occasioned by the expansion of the DuPont plant at Barksdale. This aspect of the Great War, I think, the impact on Washburn, it cannot be overstated. But it does tend to overwhelm many of the other effects it had on the community. So here's surprise number one. I'm not going to be talking much about Barksdale tonight at all. We've done a number of programs. I did a full program on Barksdale. We've also done programs on other aspects of the DuPont Company's expansion, the neighborhood of houses that was built and then moved to Duluth, the Memorial Park that was a gift. Incredible impact, but so much else. And it tends to get a little bit lost in the overwhelming importance of the whole DuPont plant history. So as I say, I'll mention it, but I'm going to go down other pathways tonight. Of course, I also want to follow the journeys of the servicemen and women who went over there. But even skipping over the Barksdale story, there's still way too much to cover in 1 hour. So in the interest of truth in advertising, I'm going to warn you guys now that tonight's talk is only going to be half the story. Carl and I talked about this, and this is going to be the first half of a two-parter. And so Lord willing, we'll all be back here in December or January to hear part two during the Winter Festival. And finally, though, I'll be doing, come on up, Susan, for a minute. Though I'm going to be doing all the talking, which is kind of the way it usually is in the household, tonight's presentation has been a joint effort from start to finish between Susan and myself. The topic of the Great War has long fascinated both of us, and we've studied it together for years. We've explored the battlefields together. We've paid respects at graves and memorials together, and the topic comes up at our dinner table quite often. So much of the material that you'll see in this presentation comes straight from the collection of the Washburn Historical Museum, where Susan has put together a really nice exhibit, little plug here, for the centennial. And when this is all over the weekend or something, I'd encourage you. So just want to know, this is a joint thing from now on. And now, thank you, dear. Now you can sit down. And now, to get down to the real business at hand, we're going to leave Washburn, and we're not even going to go out to over there. We're going to go out to California, where a young man from Washburn is about to embark on a motorcycle trip, cross-country trip. His name was Willie. Having trouble hearing?
Get closer to the mic.
All right, he's going to have to fiddle with the mic a little bit more. All righty. How about now? Any better?
Oh,
Thank you. Thank you all. Okay.
if you don't get feedback, it's not loud.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, Asa Willie, his name was. He was born in Bayfield, raised in Washburn, and in the spring of 1916, he was working at a DuPont plant out in California. And for whatever reason, he was coming back home, start back here at Barksdale, and rather than buying a train ticket, he bought himself a motorcycle and went to do the whole Easy Rider thing across the country 50 years before the movie came out. And if we look at the Washburn Times, that was big news up here. The paper followed him in their weekly updates. If you look on June 8th, 1916, we get a report. Ace Willie, who has been working in one of the powder plants at the DuPont Company in the Pacific Coast, is now speeding across country on a motorcycle trip, making his way to Arizona, and will be soon heading north to Denver, Colorado, where he will take the Lincoln Highway directly east, making 100 miles a day in the desert. In a card received on Monday, Mr. Willie stated that all was well in Arizona, and he was traveling in company with a man and his wife and daughter who were traveling in a Ford. Ace said the Ford was too slow for him and that he's compelled to wait for the four-wheel machine to catch up. This has slowed Ace down considerably, and for a few days he's only been averaging 100 miles a day, while on the first day out, he made nearly 200 miles. Well, in subsequent weeks, we learned that Ace crossed the desert safely, and eventually split from his companions so that he could make better time. He made his way through the Great Plains without much difficulty, but during the last lap of his trip to Kansas and Iowa, encountered muddy roads which held him up for a time. And finally, on June 29th, 1916, the Times reported that after almost a month on the road, Ace arrived home wearing a beautiful tan and telling the folks that he traveled over some beautiful country and some very poor stretches, and that he'd had enough riding to do him for some time. Now, if Ace thought he saw enough mud for a while, 2 years later he went to a place where he would see a lot more. And if riding through the desert seemed like an adventure, the adventure was heightened in 1918, just 2 years ahead of time, when a German U-boat torpedoed the troop ship that was carrying him and several thousand Wisconsin boys over to France. Now, Ace survived. As a matter of fact, all of the Washburn boys on that boat survived. But 200 American servicemen lost their lives on this ship. This is a painting of it called the Tuscany. And Ace, as they say, survived, lived to a ripe old age. And one of the treasures in the History Museum here across the road is his photo album from the war. And a lot of the photos that you'll see, some of them today and many more in the second part, come directly from Ace's photo album, which is one of the treasures in the museum. Now, there's also plenty of mud in Washburn, but we were working on sidewalks and such. And Washburn was kind of at a low ebb at that point. I mean, looking at it, it doesn't look like the world's most prosperous town. And as a matter of fact, at that particular point in time, it was one of Washburn's lowest ebbs, the first decade or so of the 20th century. The logging boom, which had built up the town and sustained it for a couple of decades, had crested. And there was no real industry coming in to replace it. The DuPont plant had opened up, but it was nowhere near the level of activity that it would later accomplish. And to give you an idea just how broke Washburn was at the time, in about 1912, the city council passed a resolution. Pete, you listening? The city council passed a resolution not to light the street lights in the winter. Or on nights, summertime nights when the moon was bright enough to get away without it. You know, that shows, you know, you're kind of broke there at that point. Municipal budget, well, rather in the 5 years from 1905 to 1910, the population of the town decreased by 22%. Went down from almost 5,000 to less than 4,000. And then all of a sudden, how lucky we have a war going, right? Yes, suddenly the economic boom occasioned by the war had dollar signs and prosperity in a lot of eyes. The newspapers were full of rosy predictions for the future of Washburn, as if booms don't end. The Washburn Times, 1915, just at the beginning, business conditions in the city were never brighter than they are today. The future of Washburn looks bright. The people of the city should make the most of it. Let's build up the city while the building is good. And 2 years later, a column from the president of the Commercial Club, the forerunner of the Chamber of Commerce, predicted confidently that within a decade, Washburn would have a population of 50,000. Well, let's take a look at the population of Washburn at that point. One of the things that jumps right out at you, that Washburn at the time was very much a community of immigrants. In 1910, 30% of the residents of Washburn were foreign born. 30% were not born in the US. And then, if you look at the people who had parents born overseas, it bumps up to 54%. Only 16% of the population could claim that both of their parents were born in the US. And that ratio mirrors the state of Wisconsin. In 1910, the population of Wisconsin was 2,300,000 roughly. And listen to this, 38% of Wisconsinites were either born in or had parents who were from Germany, Austria, or Hungary, the main population centers of the so-called Central Powers. 38% of the state's population had family ties to the powers that we were soon going to be fighting. They had grandparents, they had uncles, they had cousins, and brothers and sisters over there, and caused a lot of mixed feelings among the population here, particularly in Wisconsin. There was a widespread sense of ambivalence about the Great War in Europe in those first couple of years. Largely the American public favored neutrality. If you go back and you look, there were people on both sides rooting for one ancestral country and another, but largely neutrality was everyone's goal. It didn't necessarily work out all that way. First of all, because the U.S. Was trading heavily with the Allied powers and not with the Central Powers, with the Germans and their Austrian and other allies. This did not set well with a lot of the German-American population here in Wisconsin. And in fact, quite naturally, a lot of German-Americans started raising money for relief for people who were suffering the deprivation of wartime in their ancestral land. The German-American Alliance, a fraternal and benevolent group, had 37,000 members in Wisconsin. And they raised that money by selling pictures of the Kaiser and Emperor Franz Josef of Austria. This is not good PR. And another episode that caused a bit of a scandal actually happened over the border in Canada. Now remember that Canada was part of, subject to the Queen at that point, and the Canadians went to war right with the rest of the empire. And so they were fighting well before we got involved. And over in Winnipeg in 1916, at the outset of war, the Ukrainian bishop, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, sent out a message to all the able-bodied men of his church. It's time to go back home and fight for your king. That caused one heck of an uproar in Canada, and eventually he retracted that admonition. But again, it caused a lot of hard feelings, and things like this led to a tremendous amount of discrimination, suspicion, whatever, of German-American citizens and immigrants. And we'll be touching on that quite a bit over the course of this program and the next. Sometimes it got really, really ugly. And just as an aside, here's a funny thing. Here's the Ukrainian bishop saying it's the duty of every loyal Ukrainian in Canada to go back home and fight for your nation. And that caused a stir. I happen to know a gentleman who was born in London, came over as a small child to the U.S., and with the outbreak of war at the age of 35, hied up to Canada from his home in Virginia, took a train to Canada, enlisted in the Canadian Army, and fought for king and country there, leaving America behind. He didn't get any flack for it. And I know that because that was my grandfather. So, again, a bit of a double standard we're seeing. And I love this map here. I almost forgot to mention it. The sedition map. I don't know if you can read the legend from back there, but it's a little guide put out by an organization called the Wisconsin Loyalty League to the areas of the state that are infected with Germanism. And so these are the areas that are filled with treason. And now see, what I don't understand, now you look, there's these big blotches down there, around Milwaukee and some of the other places, but if you look, number 11, just a tiny little dot over by Clam Lake. And I'm looking and trying to figure out where was the German-American Bund in that. I mean, there was nothing there. All I can think is maybe there's like some farmer named Schultz, and they said, we better check him off, too. Talk about the boondocks, though. So, anyway, one of the things that the German embassy did, one of the many PR strategies they picked up on, was sending around a petition, a very innocent-seeming petition, the embargo petition, which basically was saying that, urging the U.S. government to cut off trade with all belligerents. No trade with the Germans, no trade with the British, we'll just stay pretty neutral. Officially, again, that's sort of our policy. But this is a little stronger, and the German embassy sponsored it without letting people know. So it was kind of sneaky, and a couple of fellows from this neighborhood, a couple of prominent citizens actually, from this neck of the woods, signed it. Name Ungrove mean anything to you? And a fellow named William Landreth, who was the county tax assessor. And they signed this in 1916 and thought nothing else about it. And 2 years later, the Milwaukee Journal finds the old copies and goes there around and publishes the names of all the signatories. And it caused a lot of problems for one of these two men, and we'll talk about that at some point in this sequence. But I'll tell you who really stood out as a symbol of resistance to the war and eventually took heat as, quote unquote, a traitor to the nation, was Senator Bob La Follette. Now, Robert La Follette is one of the most revered political names in the history of the state. A staunch progressive. He spent a term as governor, several terms in the Senate, and as they say, is definitely one of the godfathers of progressivism in the state of Wisconsin. He was also very, very strongly against U.S. involvement in the war. When President Wilson proposed what they called the Armed Ships Act, which would have armed American merchant ships to fight back against U-boats, La Follette led the cadre of senators who opposed it and actually led a filibuster which killed the bill. At which point Life magazine published this cartoon of the Kaiser giving Senator La Follette a medal. And over there in the museum is a scrapbook that was kept by the mother of a soldier overseas. And she kept clippings on war news. And one of the clippings she decided to cut out and save in her scrapbook is this gallery of senators who are compared to Benedict Arnold as traitors. And the biggest play is given to Senator La Follette from Wisconsin. Finally, though, on April 6, 1917, after a sequence of events we all are pretty well familiar with, the U.S. did declare war on Germany. La Follette argued strongly and eloquently against it. And when he sat down after the end of his speech, he was in tears. But the Senate voted, one would say overwhelmingly. It was a huge majority. 82 for the war, 6 opposed declaration of war, 8 abstained. You know, when it comes time to a declaration of war, having nearly 20% refusing to sign on shows that the war was not universally popular. But once war was declared, the attitude moved toward closing ranks, pulling together, and destroying the Hun. The rhetoric reached levels that, unseen until fairly recently, I would say. Time to get serious. We've got to get an army out there to Europe to help our allies. And here we see a soldier, a plucky Yank, who says we can't fight, as he clutches 3 German helmet souvenirs. Well, Americans had plenty of spirit. What we didn't have was a whole lot of experience in fighting a modern war, and we didn't have very much of an army. We had a small standing army, and actually quite a few of the officer corps did manage to get some previous experience a year or 2 before, thanks to this gentleman here, Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa. Mexico was in sort of a state of perpetual revolution in the early 1900s, and Pancho Villa here, in the course of the chess game between rival factions, decided it would be to his advantage to destroy a town in New Mexico on the American side of the border. And as a result, President Wilson sent the troops into Mexico to pursue Villa, and then activated National Guard units to go down and protect the border, including, among them, 5 young men from Washburn. This clipping and all the others are taken from the Washburn Times of that era. 5 young men were pulled off their jobs at Barksdale and told to report to their National Guard unit. And then they spent, from that summer well into the next February, on the border, watching and waiting and basically hoping to go home. And I'm listening to that and it sounds familiar, and then I remember why. This 3 weeks ago. We got Wisconsin National Guard troops on the border again. There's an awful lot as I go through this. I keep saying, gee, that sounds familiar. But the time came to build an army. And to give you an idea of the size of the forces we have, really they were a pittance compared to the size of the armies fighting over in Europe. At the outbreak of the war, the U.S. Army consisted of less than 93,000 officers and men, less than 100,000 in the entire U.S. regular Army. And of those, little more than half were really available for deployment at the time, because the rest were assigned to other duties of various sorts and stuck in the States. Now, to supplement the regular Army, we had National Guard units of about another 160,000. But the National Guard units are basically part-time soldiers, and the level of training and activity varied widely from state to state. Wisconsin was one of the cream of the crop when it comes to the readiness and preparedness of our National Guard. And here in Washburn, we even organized our own National Guard company, under the command of a gentleman named Hubert H. Peavy. Hubert Peavy, an interesting character. He'd served a couple terms as mayor of Washburn, and war came, he organized a National Guard company, which would then be subsumed into the Army. This is basically the same system that had been used during the Civil War, these local companies forming and then being federalized. Advantages to that of esprit de corps and fighting alongside your friends and neighbors. The British in particular found that system could work horribly to the detriment of a small town some of our stories of towns in England where virtually all the young men were wiped out in one advance. So we've gotten away from that kind of system then. But the PV company was definitely a proud representative of Washburn. Captain PV, he was given the rank of captain. And his story takes a little strange twist in France, but we'll get to that later too. He came home safely though, spent 5 terms as congressman from our district, and finally lost the bid for a 6th term in 1934, and he retired to open up one of the first fur farms in the area. Fascinating character. I'm going to dig into him some more. But, okay, the other thing is, we also implemented a draft. First time since the Civil War. Draft, of course, I see a lot of guys in the audience of my age or older who would remember the draft issues quite well. And of course, the poster is fairly familiar, but a lot of people are surprised when they find out we ripped off the British original. Uncle Sam there is patterned after Lord Kitchener on the left, who is the British hero who was in charge of the recruiting campaign. And he has got just one awesome mustache, doesn't he though? Yes. So, we've got ourselves a Washburn company, and we also now have conscription, and on May 31st, 1917, it's right there in black and white, all men, every male between the ages of 21 to 31 years, whether citizens of the United States or not, are to submit themselves to a registration of the regular election voting places on Tuesday. Failure to register on the above date will be punishable by imprisonment in the federal prison for a term of 1 year. No excuses can be offered for failure to participate. Well, good news. A week later, that paper reported, our recruitment exceeds all expectations. The Bayfield County's young men, 1,660 in number, went to the polls on Tuesday, June 5th, and registered for military service in Uncle Sam's great Army and Navy, doing so without a murmur of complaint, save in 1 or 2 cases. Well, all right, now you got an army, but we don't have tanks, we don't have rifles, we don't have supplies, and the first thing we got to do is produce. And in order to produce, we need money to pay for all the costs of running a war. And the Wilson administration made a firm decision. We're going to pay for this, not by soaking with taxes. We're not going to be going to commercial banks to take off loans that will be paying off at high interest rates for decades to come. We're going to get the citizens to pay for the war themselves. And how are we going to do that? By appealing to patriotism and a sense of shared sacrifice. And the Treasury Secretary, William McAdoo, basically, what it was written in the one history that I cooked is kind of interesting. He had another ulterior motive. McAdoo believed it would be possible to sell bonds at a lower interest rate than would be possible if you sought commercial credit, and he also had an agenda that siphoning money out of people's pockets would reduce demand for consumer goods that were going to be scarce anyway. Clever. So, the campaign pulled out all the stops. Let's everybody buy the Liberty bonds. Those of us who grew up on Warner Brothers cartoons probably remember Bugs Bunny singing, "Get your bonds today." That was World War II. Did that again. But in World War I, they didn't have Warner Brothers cartoons yet. They relied on a lot of media. Posters for one. Gentle persuasion here with the kiddies and Uncle Sam. Some scare tactics. Let's keep those German boots off American soil. I'll tell you, to be honest, if German boots were going to be on American soil, they wouldn't be covered with blood because they'd be wet and muddy from having crossed the water. But okay, you know, There's the scare tactic. And then, if that's not good enough, there's other kinds of pressure. Are you 100% loyal American? You better prove it. Your friends and neighbors will be watching to see if you buy your share of Liberty bonds. And believe me, they weren't joking it around. Here is an ad right in our own little paper. Your neighbors are watching you. And they did. And the papers helped out. They would publish the names of everyone who bought the bonds. And if you didn't, if your name wasn't on it, you were a slacker. That was the term, slacker. It was a real term of insult at that point. And the worst thing you could be called was disloyal. All right? The kiddies, though, the students at the school have proved their loyalty by buying bonds, by buying savings stamps for the kids. A few pennies. If you didn't, you were disloyal. Folks at the Canfield Lamoureux Box Company, 90 employees, 88 of them bought Liberty bonds. Only 2 refused. And the newspaper commented that on the editorial page. We hear that 2 men at the box factory plants refused to subscribe for Liberty bonds. And upon investigation, their names savor with sauerkraut. It got to the point that the pressure to buy Liberty bonds was so harsh that people were going out in the middle of the night and painting houses yellow, painting cars yellow. I don't find any record of that happening here. I know it happened in Mellon, as close to that. There were other things that happened in this area that were even worse, and we'll get to that at some point. But certainly, the pressure was on here, and it was helped by legislation. Wisconsin has the best sedition law in the nation. If you want to charge a man with sedition, it's very easy to do it here, says the newspaper approvingly. And it played out in a bar in Washburn in September of 1917, where the paper reports a man giving his name as Andrew Lundgren was picked up by Police Chief Markey this morning and charged with offering remarks detrimental to the United States government and favoring Germany. Witnesses have been secured who heard the ranting of Lundgren, and they say his remarks about the government were frightful. Lundgren will be placed in the hands of the United States Marshals today. Well, a week later, we get an update. Andrew Lundgren was locked up by the local police last Thursday morning, charged with uttering damaging statements against the United States government. Was released from custody on Tuesday of this week on orders from United States Attorney Wolf. Lundgren was given a severe lecture by President D.M. Maxey of the County Defense Council, and he appeared to be extremely sorry for his utterances and promised to be good in the future. On investigation, it was found that Lundgren has a son serving in the United States Navy. The father of a serviceman isn't safe if he says the wrong word. Lundgren thanked the defense counsel for having him locked up, for he said while he remained in jail, he came to see things in a new light. Yeah, somebody said, oh my goodness, I agree. So I think at this point, we could take a break and maybe stop back at the bar. Because these rumors of prohibition are really starting to get on my nerves. It may happen. Appears there's a definite contingent who believe that the brewers in Milwaukee are allied with the Kaiser. And any nickel that is spent on beer is 1 nickel less you could buy for a war bond. So I'm going to get myself a beer. Back in 10 minutes, folks. changes in our lives. Because we all have to tighten our belts, and we have to pull together, and we've got to conserve the resources that are going to be needed by our troops over there. And I have to pull together and work harder. And one of the things we can probably do is save a little bit on electricity if we set the clocks, mess with the clocks a little. The concept of daylight savings time is one of the many innovations we can credit to the Great War. Hold 1 second. Another one, you'd be surprised. The whole revolution in shopping and daily routine shopping, we can tie to the events of the Great War and the conservation measurements needed. In turn of the century America, housewives would do their marketing on pretty much a daily basis. People didn't have cars, and you would basically go to the grocery store, hand a friendly neighborhood grocer a list, and later on in that day, his employee would deliver the groceries to your door. And no cash changed hands. Everybody knew everybody else, and all the customers had an account. And this took place at a half a dozen grocery stores all across little towns like Washburn. And one of the first measures that the War Reduction Board implemented was an order that this practice of multiple deliveries should stop. Because it was wasteful of fuel, but even more importantly, it was wasteful of manpower. We can't be using up our young men delivering groceries to housewives. We need to use them up in Flanders. So very soon, the grocery stores and butchers and other merchants were forced to get together and come up with a central delivery system. And they would pool their resources, and they would deliver to everybody's customers, just one driver. And that worked out well enough here. It caused problems in Hurley, though, because Wisconsin was much more aggressive in enforcing this particular policy than Michigan was. So the merchants of Hurley were all biting the bullet and eliminating deliveries, and the grocers in Ironwood were saying, hey, we can deliver anytime you want, lady. So that kind of stuck for a while, but then the grocers of Ironwood got together, people prevailed on their patriotism, and they said, we're going to follow the Wisconsin rules. So let's hear it for the grocers of Ironwood. Sense of fair play. Sense of fair play. But along with the delivery system, that whole credit system went out the window. The old days of, Mrs. Jones has an account at the grocer that she pays once a month, gave way to actually having to carry money and pay cash. And that went across a lot of industries, not just groceries, but anything from hardware stores and everything on up. People were used to running tabs. Now, the whole idea of cash and carry came in, thanks to wartime conservation measures. But really, more than anything else, the stress was on saving food. Let me just give you a couple of items here. Again, published in the Washburn Times, a statement from the president of the Wisconsin Federations of Women's Clubs. Never before has America faced the responsibility of supplying food for its own people and fighting men, and also for the nations by whose side we are fighting. We must share with our allies to the last crust. Food conservation is therefore a duty which every citizen owes to the country, a dictate of patriotism which, in the words of the President, no one can now expect ever to be excused or forgiven for ignoring. Basically what had happened was there were several years, the perfect storm thing, several years of bad harvests in a row. The war was disrupting transportation in Europe, and it was also calling all the young men who had been working on the farms as soldiers. America was serving for a while there as the world's breadbasket. And of course, that meant Americans had to tighten their belts. And that became a very, very strong push. Conserve food. If there's nothing else, you'll learn saving food is patriotic. That's the way we can all contribute. Each and every one, clean your plate and don't overeat. And that was pushed hard. Washburn Times warned everybody, don't get your act together, don't toe the line. There may be a rationing system coming, like did happen in the Second World War. The government appointed a food czar, created an agency called the U.S. Food Administration, and in charge of it they put a businessman turned humanitarian relief advocate named Herbert Hoover. And Hoover absolutely took charge, took the ball and ran with it. To the point that people referred to the policy of saving food as Hooverizing. First time I heard that, I said, yeah, probably once or twice. Keeps turning up every week in the Washburn newspapers and the Ashland newspapers. Are you Hooverizing? And one of the first things that Hoover did was he composed a pledge, an 8-point pledge. Excuse me, this is only 6 of them, but there were 8 in the final version. Basically, pledge drives are organized in towns all over Wisconsin, and I'm sure all over the rest of the country, where volunteers were drafted to knock on doors and get every household to sign off an 8-point pledge that they would follow the premises of Hooverizing, save food because it was needed. And if you signed your pledge, they would give you a little card to put in your window so that nobody would bother you again. And if you didn't have a card in your window, you would get bothered. And again, the persuasion went from friendly and gentle to pretty harsh. Wheat was the #1 critical item. And more than anything else, it's kind of interesting to me. I would have expected, they said, meatless Fridays and things like that. Wheatless Wednesdays. Conserve wheat. Bakers were told to cut down the richness of their flour. I mean, to the smallest detail. Save wheat was the message. It had to be a surplus of wheat to send overseas to feed our troops and our allies. Corn. I mean, corn is a part of the American diet, but at that time it was looked at as more of a southern delicacy or a southern staple and animal food. Big push to get people to eat more corn, more potatoes. Potatoes are only for those Irishmen. Eat more corn, eat more potatoes, save wheat. Article in the Washburn Times, stale bread and what to do with it. Don't waste a crust. And here's an idea, eat more rabbits. Again from our paper. Supplementary meat supply. It's a wonderful protein. I'm sure somewhere if you read through they say it tastes like chicken. Government, was state government followed aggressively on recruiting farmers into planting more and more crops. Farmers were a little skeptical because they've been through boom and bust, and sometimes, they've been followed the directions and then left with surplus on their hands. But there was no resisting now. And of course, here's how much the pressure was. Over in Ashland, the railroad invited people to come and plant gardens along the tracks on the right-of-way. If you walk too close to railroad tracks these days, you get the railroad police on you. They opened up, they put in a few rules and regulations, keep out of the way of the trains and don't interfere with our operations. But anybody in Ashland who wants can get a permit to plant a garden along the railroad right-of-way. Kids, get them early, get them young, get them part of the process. And right here it says, helping Hoover in our Victory Garden. One of the folks in this area who is really behind it, very active in getting kids planting gardens, was the county agricultural agent, a man named Vern Brubaker. Now, some of you old-timers in the room may be familiar with that name. Anybody here familiar with Vern Brubaker? All right, you actually met him?
Brubaker's partner.
There you go. Vern Brubaker was the county agricultural agent. He also had a nursery just outside of town, and he is the gentleman who is responsible for all those beautiful lupins we see along the way. So, Mr. Brubaker, thank you. And the push was very much aimed at the women of the country and of the community. I love this particular poster. Will you help the women of France? Appealing to sisterhood. In fact, women were very much considered a crucial element of victory. And here, in the Washburn Times, they reprinted a statement, a column by the president of the National Women's Trade Union League of America that says, this is the finest hour in history for women. And she goes on to predict that with all the involvement of women in the war effort, when it's all over, you will see that women will get the vote. And in fact, almost like clockwork, 1920, the 19th Amendment, less than a year and a half after the armistice, women were finally given the long-denied right to vote. Now, one of the things I find kind of amusing and just goes to show the times, here we have the president of the National Women's Trade Union League, and her name is Mrs. Raymond Robbins. That drives an historian nuts. You never know the women's names. But even the president of a labor organization is using her husband's name in public correspondence. It just goes to show how the world we lived in. And women were definitely part of the effort. Well, and the propaganda that came up was aimed both at young and old doing their equal share. Quite an appeal to help the French. The French were our pals, very much our pals in those days. And I love this particular juxtaposition here. You have Jeanne d'Arc on the one side, raising her sword, and over here, Mrs. America raising her vegetable, her mason jar. You'll notice, by the way, the funny little hat that our American lady is wearing. That's called a Liberty cap. It's, if you look on the French emblem, Marianne, the woman who personifies France, she's wearing a Liberty cap. They came into style in the French Revolution. They go all the way back to ancient times. Looks pretty hokey, but some people have asked, that actually has symbolic meaning. But of course, much of this was aimed at the traditional domestic sphere of women in the home. Canning, saving food, making ends meet, being conservative, being thrifty. But there certainly were women who were moving outside the traditional sphere. We hear a lot about Rosie the Riveter in World War II. We don't hear that much about the women who came into the workforce in the First World War. There were not as many in number, but they were opening the door. They were opening the door here in Washburn at the Kenfield Lamoureux box factory, where they brought in 8 women workers, quote unquote, the paper, to work on some of the lighter jobs. They showed up in dainty brown coveralls provided by the company. So condescending, but still, they're opening the door for future generations. And there were other women who participated even more actively. These are nurses in training at the hospital in Ashland, on their way eventually overseas. And among the volunteers from Bayfield County who lost their lives in the First World War was Anna Cosgrove, a Red Cross nurse from Washburn, who shipped out as soon as she got her nursing degree, made it to France. We're not quite sure exactly how she died. Apparently there was a fire at the hospital where she was assigned. She survived the fire, and apparently, whether or not she was injured, don't know, but she had a stroke shortly after the fire. This is in the late 1918, just as the war is winding down. They brought her back home, treated her in a hospital in New York for several months, and she passed away in New York. But according to the best records Susan and I have come up with, we can find the names of 11 servicemen and women from Washburn who gave their lives in the First World War, and Anna Cosgrove here was among them. Security was definitely a concern here. Paranoia might be a better word, because people were seeing German spies everywhere. We saw what happened to poor Mr. Lundgren shooting his mouth off in a bar. But it could get worse. And a lot of it did make sense. It's reasonable if you've got a plant that's making dynamite and munitions for the military, you're going to increase the guard force. And they did. They hired around the clock, about 25-man guard force. They put up searchlights all around the DuPont plant, and kept the German saboteurs away. As a matter of fact, the military actually came into Barksdale at the height of the employment. There were more than 2,000 men working at the plant, and the military security folks came in and did a sweep, checking everybody for draft evaders, and they hauled in over 100 men for failure to produce registration cards. And almost all of them turned out, well, yeah, I registered and I didn't have my paperwork with me. Sorry about that. But the paper pointed out there were at least 3 men who had no evidence ever have registered. And the paper pointed out these men were Greeks. They were immigrants. Can't trust them. And in fact, this paranoia just continued to grow. With the formation of an outfit called the Wisconsin Loyalty League, which was a bunch of super patriots, as they're called, nationalists, whatever you want to call them, who are basically snooping around and telling everybody how to behave like a good American should by their definition. And as you go through the papers from 1917 and 18, you see just one story after another of the atmosphere that's beginning to develop. German classes were abolished, both the Ashland and the Washburn school systems. We don't need anybody speaking German. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. It just seems to me that knowing what the enemy is communicating might be a good idea. But no, more important that we don't allow people to be infected with German culture. proposing that everybody should be required to sign a pledge that we are Americans first, last, and always. And if you don't sign, then you're not a patriot. You're disloyal. A lot of talk about voter fraud. The Ashland paper. Guy was just deaf on immigrants. He was sure that there were a lot of illegal immigrants voting. He wasn't going to have any of it. As a matter of fact, Ashland Press was not big on any immigrants. Some weeks it was the Finns who was in his bad graces. I should save that for Irene next week, shouldn't I? But on a much more positive note, our doughboys are getting together and heading off for a war. And I will be wrapping up soon, but I want to take a quick look at what our men are doing. And we'll do that thanks to the photo album of Ace Willie, who's finally found his camera as he heads off to Camp Douglas in southern Wisconsin. And there he is, all spiffy in his uniform. Hey, Willie, here he's down in Waco, Texas, but we haven't gotten to Waco yet. We're in the first assembly camp here, Camp Douglas, and down near Madison. And actually, the war doesn't look too rough. Down there, playing baseball, Camp Douglas, 1917. 2 poker games at Camp Douglas, Wisconsin, 1917. Matter of fact, they even got visitors from home down there at Camp Douglas. If you check the paper, September 27th, 1917. The war's been on for a few months. They've been down at Camp Douglas for about a month. And William Olson and M.E. Doyle and their wives motored to Camp Douglas Sunday afternoon to see the boys before they leave for Waco, Texas. They found the Washburn boys in good spirits and anxious to leave for Waco. And that will bring them closer to the fighting front. Well, stuff got real once they got down to Waco. Left for Waco, a couple of train loads, and assembled in Texas. Now, gentleman on the left there, you've seen him before. He was the man in the center of the photo working on the sidewalk, the very beginning of the program tonight. He was the guy smiling at the camera as his friends worked on the sidewalk. His name is Ed Boleen. He didn't come home. He's another one of those 11 who gave their lives for the country. Here he is in Waco, getting ready, learning how to be a soldier and go overseas. And Ace shows us scenes of the daily life, keeping clean in camp. A lecture on how to be a soldier. They were given, you know, these mostly are civilians coming off the farm and out of towns. They have to learn the ins and outs of how to fight a war. Meanwhile, there was one boy from Washburn who, in fact, already had plenty of experience. A fellow named Alfred Swanby, who was a boy from Washburn who had moved to Canada and joined the Canadian Army, just like my grandfather. And unlike my grandfather, he had been in the thick of the fighting. My grandfather was another one of them who got sick and eventually was invalided home. But Alfred Swanby, a boy from Washburn, was at 2 of the most ferocious battles, most terrible, notable battles of the war. At Verdun, fighting with the Canadian unit alongside the French, and also at Vimy Ridge, which was sort of like the Canadian Gallipoli. It was the battle that formed the identity of the Canadian military. And a boy from Washburn was in this trench here at Vimy Ridge, or one very much like it. That's a photo not from Ace's album, but it's a photo of Vimy Ridge, where when the rest of the Washburn boys were just learning to fight, Alfred Swanby was already in his second major battle. And we'll hear a little bit more on him in the second program. But on our way back to Waco, we look down this line of soldiers, ship-shape now. Strack was the term I used to remember. Ready to ship out, and somewhere in that line is a young man from Washburn named Byron Jacobson. Byron had enlisted with a lot of the other young men in the company formed by Captain Peavy. And he got down to Camp Douglas and was sent home. Doctors looked at him and said he was not medically fit. Well, he must have appealed or something, because very shortly he got back on a train, went down to Camp Douglas with an arrangement that when they got to Waco, he would have an operation at the Army Medical Hospital there to correct, quote, a minor disability and allow him to fight. They were very coy about what that minor disability was. So I don't know what it was, but he could have stayed home. He had done his bit, and they said, no, you're not fit for the Army. He could have stayed home. But he found a way to rejoin his unit, went to the extent of having an operation so he could get in the Army and fight alongside for his country. He made it down as far as Waco, but he never made it to France. After all that effort that he went to, Byron Jacobson came down with typhoid and passed away in Waco before making it to France. His body returned to Washburn, where they held a funeral for him. The newspapers reported in great detail on the funeral of the first Bayfield County boy lost in the war. And like so many, he fell not by enemy action, but by the diseases that ran through the camps in those days. And Byron Jacobson's funeral was held at the Lutheran Church, ceremony at the courthouse, and he remains here today in Woodland Cemetery, just across the road from my house, along with nearly a half dozen others, young men from Washburn who lost their lives in the war. And when we come back in December, I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically about what our doughboys saw and did in France, and some more of the blowback that took place here on the home front, both good and very ugly. And we'll start out with Ace Willie's encounter with the North Atlantic. Stay tuned for next time.